Okay, welcome to week 5. Again, the time is going by very quickly. This week we're going to be talking about the experiential approaches, and there's a number of ones that fall under them. The most famous are Carl Whitaker and Virginia Satir, and we'll give you some of the highlights, some of the main things that, again, are going to be on the licensure exam. But before we do that, I'm going to ask you to do something this week. Okay, so this week I'm going to ask you to first post a picture of the contents of your refrigerator. I'm going to ask, in order for this to work, I need you to do it by Tuesday. And then I'm really going to ask you not to make any changes to the contents of your refrigerator. And then once people have started posting the pictures of the refrigerator, I want you to each make observations about what you believe the contents of your fellow students' refrigerators reveal about their personality or lifestyle. Is there an object that stands out as a reflection of some aspect of that person or of their life cycle stage or other important aspect of them? And then on Saturday or Sunday, I'm going to ask you to share about your experience of what it was like hearing observations, what things rang true, what things you didn't agree with, and so forth. Just general observations about your experience of having people talk about the contents of your refrigerator. Okay. So the basic premises of the experiential symbolic models are basically, they look at health versus dysfunction. And the way that they define health is, for example, a family that is considered to open, able to express feelings, have a flexibility, are able to take risks with one another. Where in contrast, dysfunctional families are ones who resist taking affective risks and are very rigid in their interactions. They're kind of like walking on eggshells. They're more anxious about their interactions. Children in dysfunctional families grow up repressed and unable to express their feelings in healthy ways. So the experiential branch of family therapy stems from the humanistic existential theories of the 1960s. Think of it. A lot of these theories came out of the hippie movements and that period of time. Humanistic models believe in self-actualization of individuals, kind of the idea that we become stuck along our journey, but we're capable of achieving self-actualization. Like when you're living your real true self, that's sort of the goal of an experiential approach. It draws on Gestalt, psychodrama, client-centered therapy, and some of the group movements. There's a real emphasis on the here and now, on getting in touch with emotions, the affective expression, spontaneity, action, encounter. Like there's a whole, if you wanted to look more into it, there in the 1960s, there were these things called encounter groups, were really all about really expressing the most fundamental aspects of their humanity, getting more in touch with that. It's definitely more process oriented in its nature. Experiential therapists seek to assist individuals to be more honest emotionally, to express themselves more directly, to sort of break through like things that have made them become socially, I'm trying to think of how to say it, conforming to social expectations. This theory suggests that health increases with more open communications. One of the possible critiques, so this won't be on the licensure, but possible critiques is, are these models systemic? Now, I think I'm a big fan of Virginia Satir, so I think what she did was systemic, but some people critique it in that it looks more at the emotional experiences of individuals rather than the interactions that are happening. Experiential models tend not to have clearly articulated ways of conducting therapy because you're really supposed to be going with your gut, being led sort of by your emotions and about your intuition rather than a focus on like assessments and rigid steps. So a lot more emphasis is placed on creativity. Okay, one of the big names in this, and really fascinating to watch. If you could probably find examples of his work, and I'll see if I can find some on YouTube. Carl Whitaker. So Carl Whitaker's creative and spontaneous thinking formed the basis of a bold and inventive approach to family therapy. He believed that active and forceful personal involvement and caring of the therapist was the best way to bring about change in families. So he was very, very active in his role in the therapist. He wasn't one of the ones sitting back and listening. He was actually standing up, moving around, getting them to move around, and using just the force of his personality. He relied on his own personality and his wisdom rather than on fixed techniques to kind of stir things up in families, to help members to open up and be more fully themselves. So this idea about theories, to theorize or to not theorize, Whitaker believed that clinicians who use theories are creating a distance between themselves and the family. Whitaker even wrote a paper entitled "The Hindrance of Theory in Clinical Work." While theory may be useful for beginning therapists, he believed that you should give it up as soon as possible and that the therapist should just be him or herself. So there might be a million different ways to be useful as a therapist, as long as you're being congruent and genuine from your own way of being in the world. So what do you think about the pros and cons of that perspective? Okay, so he didn't have a stage model exactly, but you could talk about some different basic phases that Whitaker used. One was engagement, involvement, and then disentanglement. So the therapist's role changed at each stage. Early in the stage of therapy, therapists were more powerful, more involved. Their goal was sort of to increase the anxiety of the client and to challenge the family in order to change the interactions. In the middle stage, there's kind of a shift to being more of an advisor, a consultant, and eventually family members are expected to resume more of the role that Whitaker took at the early part of the therapy process. And then in the final stages, as the family becomes more independent, as a therapist, he would sort of disengage, become more personal and sort of less involved in the family system. You could think about it like Whitaker would triangulate himself into the family for a while, use himself in that until they could function on their own. Okay, Virginia Satir, really I think one of the very best therapists. And I don't think she always gets the credit for being a theorist. She wrote basically the manual for the MRI. She was part of the MRI originally, and you can definitely, if you look at Virginia Satir's work and then look at the MRI, you're going to notice her involvement, her fingertips, the way her ideas are in there. She believed that a healthy family life involved an open and reciprocal sharing of affection, feeling, and love. Satir served as the director of training at the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto from 1959 to 1966. She was really well known for describing family roles such as the rescuer, the placater, that function to constrain relationships and interactions in the family. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk about sculpting. She believed that problems are not the problem, coping is the problem. So coping is the outcome of self-worth, rules of the family system, and links to the outside world. Well, I don't know, what do you think about that? Do you agree? Do you think that problems are ever the problem, or is it the way people are reacting to any given problem? Okay, Satir, like I mentioned, came up with these different stances, and she would actually have people physically sculpt these out. The main ones were placating, sort of like, I am nothing, how do I, kind of maybe martyrish, like avoiding conflict situations by being overly agreeable or giving into another person, being non-assertive, passive, self-effacing, sort of reflecting an inner sense of helplessness to others. Another one was blaming, sacrificing others, sort of like the opposite, to maintain their view of themselves, avoiding conflict by increasing stress temporarily. Like they get so upset and blaming that people back off if they start to approach them. There was the distractor, or the person who was, if some intense sort of conversation was happening, they'd be the one to bring up some irrelevant thing. And then the computer, or the super reasonable, like just unflappable. They avoid conflict by staying at sort of a cognitive intellectual level. Now, all of these seem really different, but they're all serving about the same focus, which is maintaining a person's anxiety. It's their safe space to go to. So people tend to fall into certain patterns. You could think about this systemically, like it wouldn't be unusual for a computer to be with a blamer, or a blamer to be with a placater. These sort of match out. There's usually different people in the system acting out different parts of this, but one's not better than the other. They're all sort of defenses for anxiety. Okay, family sculpting. So this is an intervention that Satir was famous for. She would have members mold themselves into positions symbolizing their actual relationships. So they might have this family get together and sort of sculpt out a scene that they often struggle with, and the different roles that people have. Claudia Black does sculpting and has people sculpt their families with addicts at the center, and then sculpt recovery, and then pull the addict out of the center if the family hasn't changed. There's so many different ways. I'm going to show you some clips of how I've been using sculpting and combining it with Theater of the Oppressed, and how we've been doing it on the street in Mexico City. I'll find a way to share that with you. So steps to creating a family sculpture. First, you set a scene. The therapist helps the sculptor identify a scene in the family that's going on that they want to explore. And then they choose the different role players. Individuals are chosen to portray different family members. And then they create the sculpture. The sculpture places each person in a specific metaphorical position spatially. Sometimes you could ask a less empowered person who may not have a voice often in the family, or you may ask a child to do it. Often children are the most honest about it. You could have different members do different sculptures. And then the end part of this is you process the sculpture. The sculpture and other participants sort of debrief the experience, and you talk about insights. Then you could ask them and say, okay, if you wanted to sculpt, maybe you could sculpt now how things would look if things had improved. Or maybe you could make one small movement that would make things feel more comfortable in the family.
¿Qué le dice la cena?
Yo pensaría que quitemos la agresión, quitemos los golpes y más comunicación.
Comunicación en lugar de golpes.
Sí.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, these are our classes. Okay, Richard, first walk me through and tell me what you sculpted.
Here, she's like the wife, and he's the main husband.
Okay.
Here, it's like the common height outside of a club that people already drawn.
A couple of rooms,
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And this is verbal moving to an emo.
Okay. It's an emo.
So it's
And they're yelling
verbal
at.
violence.
Okay.
Then she is trying to stop him that's going to hit her.
Okay. So she's kind of involved.
Yes. This is sexual harassment.
Okay.
And this is how bullying is taken. That's a technique.
¿Ustedes hablan mucho de esto entre ustedes o en la escuela o en su familia? ¿Hablas mucho de esto? La verdad, would you write just your thought, either what this made you think about, or something that you think would help the situation? So take 5 minutes and write your thoughts on it.
Will you give it here?